Well, thank you so much, General Tillelli. I really appreciate that kind introduction. It's an honor to be with you also, Vice Admiral Norb, Ryan, who both, MOAA does a fantastic job of getting your voice out on the Hill. I know all of you are on the Hill today, and I'm, I mean, don't underestimate the power in this room in terms of your voice on the Hill for our men and women in uniform. It's incredibly, incredibly important. And I would like to recognize and give a shout out to two great Granite Staters who are here. Phil Odom, who is MOAA's Deputy Director for Government Affairs, as well as Colonel Chad Chadwick, who is the Vice President of New Hampshire's MOAA chapter. And I can tell you that both Phil and Chad came to see me and storm me on the Hill today. So I am well informed about the issues that you are concerned about. I come to you, as the General said in my introduction, not just as a senator who's a member of the Armed Services Committee, but I also come to you as someone who is part of a military family. And in that regard, the issues that come before Congress, the General absolutely had it right. It is the bravery of our men and women in uniform, but it is also the sacrifice and support of our families that allow our men and women in uniform to serve. And that part of what we do and the impact of the policies that are enacted in Washington, particularly on pay and benefits, cannot be overlooked. Even though I think in the recent COLA fight, initially it was overlooked, and the impact that these cuts can have not only on the men and women in uniform, but most of all, when they're serving in harm's way, what they worry about for their families. And if our men and women in uniform are worrying about what is happening at home when they're over serving us in Afghanistan, Iraq, other difficult places around the world, then they cannot be focused on what we need them to be focused on. That is defending our nation and also their own safety and security under those circumstances. And that's why this is a whole picture. And I come to you today not just as a senator, but someone whose husband is a member of MOAA, who, when my husband served overseas, I remember worrying every day about, what was going to happen to him. And so I want to thank all the family members who are here as well for your support of our men and women in uniform and for the sacrifice that you have made. Now, I have to say, General Tillelli mentioned my role in terms of the restoring the COLA cut that had been taken from our working age military retirees. But actually, I believe that the restoring of these benefits was MOAA at its best. Because what we saw in December was very much a disconnect between Washington and those who have sacrificed the most for our country. And that disconnect is why your voice on the Hill is so important. We have less than 1% of our population that is serving to defend the rest of the nation, to keep us safe and secure. And without safety, we cannot enjoy the freedoms in this country that we are all blessed to enjoy. We cannot have or pursue the careers that Americans want to pursue or have the economic prosperity that we want for our nation. And without that connection between Congress understanding what that 1% does so that the rest of us can live in a free and prosperous nation, then we really lose sight of what is most important in Washington. And what worried me most about that budget agreement that came out in December is that there was a disconnect. Because as you know, the budget agreement asked for a reduction in the cost of living allocation for our military retirees, working age retirees, who, by the way, most of them have done multiple tours this generation in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what that meant when they do those tours, of course, is that if they have a spouse at home, that spouse can't have the same career or opportunities to earn income because they're always moving around and they're away, and that spouse has to stay home and help take care of their family and the things at home. And I think that was misunderstood in Congress in terms of what that means. I think there was a great disconnect in Congress of understanding what an average E7 makes for retirement after having put in 20 years and done multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and what the impact that does and their opportunity to earn. And I also believe that there was a huge disconnect because if you looked at that budget agreement, the only group that was asked to make a sacrifice, unfortunately, was our military retirees who had been in harm's way, who had taken the bullets for us, who had made the sacrifice, many of whom still carry the wounds of that sacrifice today, because there were cuts that were proposed, or not cuts, but additional contributions that federal employees were going to have to make to their retirement. But those changes were prospective for only new hires, not to current retirees. So what came out in December were cuts currently to military retiree cost of living increases, which were essentially a penalty and I don't think you could describe it any way else in terms of their retirement and the thousands of dollars of impact that those cuts were going to have on our men and women in uniform over a period of years. And by the way, the data that MOAA put together for that, showing the impact on your average retiree, was critical to this debate and really showing and demonstrating to members of Congress why this was so wrong and why this was not some minor cut to cut the cost of living increase 1%, that it was really a very significant penalty. And so I say this was MOAA at its best, because when this came out, at first, people tried to play it off as, oh, this is not a big deal. This is a minor agreement. This is something that somehow came from the Pentagon, or this was an idea. You know what I thought was really telling during this debate? No one took ownership for this idea, right? So we went to the Pentagon. We said, well, did you come up with this? No one ever asked us. You go to the House. Was this your idea? No, I don't know where this came from. It came from the Pentagon. I mean, I think it's very telling that once the facts came out about this, no one took ownership for the cuts. But this was a wake-up call, and MOAA was at its best because your voices were out there in the community and talking to members of Congress about the real impact this was going to have to those who have sacrificed so much for our country and to their families. And by the way, that they earned, because these were retirement benefits that our men and women earned, not something that we're giving to them. They earned it with their sweat, with their blood, and it seems to me that your voice on the Hill made the difference, because I saw it right away, but it was MOAA, and in New Hampshire, Colonel Chad Chadwick stood with me in the beginning before the budget deal was even inked, before we even voted on it, and we stood together with other service organizations and said, here's the impact, here's why it's wrong, here's why I personally am going to vote against this budget agreement unless this part of it gets fixed. But MOAA had a huge part in that and a huge voice, and you were listened to on the Hill. You should have been listened to initially, but people turned around pretty quick on this, thankfully, in that they grandfathered those who have already retired from the military. Now, there is still an issue that remains, and that are those individuals who are joining now, as of January. That COLA cut, which is essentially a penalty, still remains in place, and no one has done the analysis as to what impact this reduction in the cost of living increase for military retirees will have on retention or on people staying in, not only retention, but enlistment. And that was one of the problems with this. All of this was done in the context where Congress ignored its own laws, because we had voted on a commission to look at all of the benefits and say what should be done and what is the right thing to do. And one of the charges of that commission is to look at what will changes in benefits do in terms of enlistment and retention. And this cut never went through the commission. No one would take ownership for it. And it also violated Congress's own provisions in the commission, which said that any changes that should be made need to be made prospectively, that people need to be grandfathered. So that was so shocking about all of this, is that Congress proposed a budget that violated its own commission language that said any changes would be prospective. Congress ignored even receiving the results of its own commission and thought that this would all just, happen and that was a minor cut. So your voice of pointing out the hypocrisy that really was in place in terms of ignoring the law that we had already passed and having a commission look at these issues as a whole and focus on enlistment and retention, and really what will this do to the force structure as a whole. These were the important facts that MOAA brought forward. And I am pleased that the Congress did the right thing and reversed in terms of those who have already served and grandfathered the military retirees. But I want you to know I do remain concerned that there was not any analysis done in terms of what this cut will do going forward for retention within our military. I want to talk to you about what is happening right now as we look forward across the budget window and the FYDP over the defense budget. This morning, in the Personnel Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee, we had a hearing in which the primary discussion in the hearing were proposed changes that the military has made for the 2015 budget. And I know that this is of deep concern to MOAA. I want you to know that this is of deep concern to me as well. And those changes, while they do not touch any of the retirement benefits, thankfully, I think that the military, having seen what happened with the budget agreement, thought we better actually follow the law and see what the commission says first, so that's a positive. However, there are some important proposals in there that will have an impact on our men and women in uniform. Number one, proposed TRICARE increases again, increases in terms of what people will have to pay at the commissaries, and also a decrease in the housing allowance for our active duty men and women in uniform. And these issues, I know all of you are storming the Hill on today. I believe these are very, very important issues, and let me tell you what I'm most concerned about. The commission that we are waiting for is supposed to look holistically at all of the benefits that our men and women in uniform receive. Why? Because the only way we can maintain being the best military in the world is to have the best people. The most important treasure and asset that we have in our military are our people. And yet we are being asked to look at things like making changes to healthcare costs, to housing allowance, to commissary, without that analysis of what this will do to people. And the questions that I asked this morning, and I want an answer to, are particularly the impact on our junior enlisted. Because unfortunately, we're in a position where we've all heard the stories where our men and women in uniform, some of them actually have to get food stamps. And we're going to make them pay more at the commissary. We're going to reduce their housing allowance. I think this is a very important question that I have not gotten an answer to. And I have asked, not only in the hearing this morning, but a prior hearing that we have had in the Readiness Subcommittee on this issue, from the military, show me the data about what will happen to each level in the service in terms of how much more they will be paying out of pocket versus what they make, so that we can understand really what you are proposing when it comes to the context of the cost of living and quality of life that our men and women in uniform have and their families. And I believe that the changes that are being proposed, we worry about all of them, but I know that we worry particularly for our junior enlisted and what that means for those who are making the least in our military, but also those who are making some tremendous, tremendous sacrifices. And the last thing that we want to do in Congress is, I think it's shameful that any of our men and women in uniform would have to receive food stamps. That is shameful. But as we look at these proposed changes, we better make sure that we aren't doing anything that actually puts more people in that position, those who have sacrificed for our country. In fact, we should be reversing that trend, not creating a situation that could actually put many of our junior enlisted in a much more difficult financial position. And they, as you know, don't make that much money, particularly given the sacrifice that they make for our country. So this issue that you have raised on the Hill, please know it is, I spoke with the chairman of the Armed Services Committee today. It is on his mind. We are all very worried about it, and we're all worried about the retention, the enlistment, and I will continue to remain focused on making sure that we preserve our treasure, the best asset we have in our military, which is our men and women in uniform. Now, I want to talk to you about a bigger picture issue that relates to this issue. And the reason that our service chiefs are coming to us on the Armed Services Committee and are making these proposals, I don't think that they enjoy making these proposals. I don't think that's why they're doing this. They are doing it because of the concerns that they have about readiness, about end strength structure, about the ability to give our men and women in uniform the best equipment, the best training, all of the core issues that we absolutely need to ensure that we give them as well, because we cannot send our men and women in uniform out to defend this nation without the right training, without the preparedness, without the best equipment. We've seen that story in the past, like Task Force Smith in the Korean War. That was shameful as well. And that is the concern, that because of where we are with sequestration, there was some relief from sequestration in the 14 budget and even looking at 15 appropriations. But all of our service chiefs have come before the Armed Services Committee and have told us that if we continue with sequestration going forward, that we are going to have a hollow force. And so what's driving these decisions is, in part, in the big picture, sequestration right now. So General Talleli was right to say that we have to, and we need MOAA's help to get Congress to address this issue. Because if you look at the risks that we are facing around the world right now, we can't afford to have an army that goes below World War II levels. We can't afford to have a Navy that reduces the number of ships it has from 285 down to 230. And I could go on, but this is the path that we are heading to really get things right. We have to look at this in the context of the bigger picture of the fiscal state of this country. Now, one of the things I said at the subcommittee hearing in personnel this morning, I believe to be very true. We have the military coming to us saying, we have to reduce housing allowance. We have to increase how much it costs at the commissary to pay. We want to increase how much it costs that military pay for health care. In December, there was a budget proposed that cut military retiree cuts. So here we are, our men and women in uniform who go on the front lines for us, and you're being asked to sacrifice first. But if you look at the big picture challenges facing our nation, $17 trillion in debt, and if you look at where we are spending our money, over 60% of what we're spending our money on is what's called mandatory spending. It's not defense spending. It's not non-defense spending of programs that are domestic programs. It is mandatory programs, Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, that if we don't face the fact that we need to work together to preserve these programs as well, but to reform them, ultimately, I see two problems. As Congress, we aren't having the courage to look in the mirror as to what the real problems are. Instead, we're coming to our men and women in uniform first and asking them to go ahead, but we aren't looking at the big picture of what needs to be addressed. And we are asking those who have sacrificed the most to sacrifice more with concerns about readiness, retention, enlistment, without looking at the big picture of the fiscal state of this country. Because defense spending, this idea that somehow defense spending is the problem, is a complete myth. If you look back historically about where we are in terms of defense spending, in fiscal year 2014, we will be spending about 3.5% of the size of our economy, or GDP, on defense spending. But historically, between 1946 to 2014, we spent on an average about 6% of our economy. So when people say that defense spending is the problem, that's just not true. The problem is that we haven't gotten our act together to take the big picture fiscal challenges on. And the more we fail to do that, unfortunately, I fear the more they will come to our men and women in uniform and say, you've got to do this, we've got to reduce the number of planes you have, the number of ships you have, the more training you have, and it will squeeze everything else, and it will squeeze out the foremost constitutional responsibility of this government, which is to defend the nation, which I know MOAA stands for and why MOAA exists. And just one statistic about why we need to address this. If we keep heading on the big picture where we are fiscally, by 2020, the US will spend more on interest on our national debt than we will spend on defending our nation. Is that telling or what? And the primary driver of that debt is that 60% I talked to you about. It's not our defense budget. We can always do better with some of the acquisition programs in the Pentagon. I think we all agree, and I'm all over that. But we have to look at the big picture. And so I would say to all of you, my commitment to you is that I will continue to focus on the treasure that is our military, and that is our people. But our people also do need the equipment, the training, and the support, and the very best technology to defend this nation as well, to ensure that they are safe and can do this in the best way. And I would say to all of you, please keep your voices up on Capitol Hill. Don't allow us to go down a road again where there's a disconnect between those who have sacrificed the most, because it's 1% of the nation, to defend the other 99%. And MOAA is that 1% and that voice that can be very loud on the Hill to make sure that that 1% is represented. But also I would say to you, urge us, and I mean us as a Congress as the whole, to have the courage to take on the big picture issues that are our $17 trillion in debt, the real drivers, the real issues. Yes, it's going to take some courage to do this, but encourage us to have the courage to do what is right for our nation, to address the fiscal challenges facing our nation, to ensure that our nation remains safe and strong, to ensure that we continue to have the very best military in the world, and that this military, we are all so proud of, every branch of this military, can continue to preserve and protect the greatest nation on earth. And that is our challenge. And MOAA has such an important voice in that challenge. And I'm just deeply humbled and honored to be here before all of you tonight. I thank you for allowing me to speak with you. And I just want to thank each of you for your service to our nation and to your families for having done this. I'm privileged to serve in the Senate, but frankly, my wingman at home, Joe Daley, who served our nation, he allows me to do this. And I know how hard what you've all done and what our men and women in uniform continue to do on our behalf as we stand here today. And I know we all hope for their safety and their security, and that's why MOAA's voice is so important to ensure that they have what they need. So thank you for having me.